Welcome to Briefing. On December 21st, 2021, Catholic Answers apologist Jimmy Akin was hosted on the Classical Theism podcast, where he spoke about the dark passages of the Bible. During his hour-long conversation, he spent about 10 minutes talking about Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 14, which is commonly referred to as marrying a captive woman. Jimmy also wrote an article in 2007 about the exact same passages. Jimmy's colleague at Catholic Answers, Trent Horn, also a Catholic apologist, wrote a book called Hard Sayings, in which he also talks about the hard passages of the Bible. I am going to remove all of the sugarcoating of these defenders of the faith and talk about these passages for what they truly are. They're Moses' regulations given to the Israelite soldiers, which allowed them to kidnap people, falsely imprison people, forced marriage, and rape of the enemy's desirable women. That's the topic for today's briefing training. Okay, it's important to take a look at the actual verse so that we know what it says. When you go to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hands, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you have desire for her, and would take her for yourself as your wife, then you shall bring her to your home, and she shall shave her head, and pare her nails, and she shall put off her captive's garb, and she shall remain in your house, and bewail her father and mother a full month. After that you may go into her, and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. Then if you have no delight in her, you shall let her go where she will, but you shall not sell her for money. You shall not treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. That's Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 14. Jimmy and Trent are not trying to determine the truth in their explanations of these passages. They are not trying to understand the motivations of the ancient scribes, and they are not explaining them from a Mosaic law perspective. What Jimmy and Trent are doing is attempting to concoct an argument that they can use to soothe Catholic people who have become upset after reading these sexually violent passages. Jimmy only acknowledges information which would help to pacify Catholics after having read these passages, and he withholds information that is accurate and truthful but would make them more upset. What Jimmy and Trent are doing is simply engaging in propaganda.
So one of the principles that people need to bear in mind is that God worked with the Israelites over a period of 1,000 years before, really more than that, but for more than 1,000 years before the time of Christ. And he educated them in his ways during that time, in a process that scholars refer to as progressive revelation. And so very early in that relationship, they had not yet been well educated in his ways.
Jimmy argues that God is using a tactic of harm mitigation and progressive revelation. Harm mitigation or harm reduction are actually the regulations are designed to protect the captive woman. Progressive revelation is the idea that God teaches his moral ways slowly over the course of time.
Was God implemented regulations to mitigate the harm that was being done. That happens in the passage dealing with divorce. It also happens here. So if we reread the passage and we note the individual parts of it, we'll see very quickly that this is not something God is approving of. This is something God is trying to mitigate. So to go over the passage again, when you go forth, not I'm approving of this. God's just saying, okay, when this happens, here's what you do.
Jimmy's idea of harm mitigation is particularly nonsensical. These regulations only apply to desirable women. They don't apply at all to undesirable women or children. The regulations for undesirable women and children is for them to be taken as plunder alongside the farm animals, or to simply be murdered on the battlefield. Let's take a look at these particular verses. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. This is Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 13 through 18. These biblical commands to commit acts of genocide are literally on the adjacent page to the war bride verses, something that Jimmy does not mention at all so as not to properly inform questioning Catholics.
Then, here's what you got to do before you can have her as your wife. You got to do all these things. 1, you bring her home to your house. 2, she shall shave her head and pare her nails. Now that's going to make her unattractive. You saw her, she had normal length hair and normal nails, and you cut it all off. So she's going to be less attractive to you while she's in your home. And she shall put off her captive's garb and shall remain in your house and bewail her father and mother a full month. So she gets to publicly, in front of you, grieve over the loss of her father and mother for 30 days. So she's crying, she's weeping, she's depressed, she's obviously acting unhappy. You were the guy who participated in conquering her people and depriving her of her father and mother. Who is being blamed here for all the anguish this woman is undergoing? You are. And so this is, again, going to make her less attractive to you. If you know this is how she really feels, she's this torn up about losing her mother and father, and you're responsible, she's going to be considerably less attractive to you. And she gets to do that for a full month. After that, you may go into her and be your husband, and she shall be your wife.
This is simply wrong. Let's take a look at the actual evidence. Jimmy argues that to remove the captive woman's beauty is to remove the motivations to rape her. This demonstrates a complete ignorance as to the motives behind sexual violence. Sexual violence is not about men seeing a beautiful woman and creating an unbridled lust that they can't control. It is very much about taking violent control and humiliating another person by violating their bodily and psychological sovereignty. That's what sexual violence motivations come from. Jimmy does not seem to understand that at all. The 30 days waiting period before the Israelite warrior is allowed to marry the woman, Jimmy argues that that is a cooling off period of time that allows the captive woman to bewail her parents, an annoyance to the Israelite warrior to make him less attracted to her. There is a better explanation that we find in Deuteronomy that is much more likely to be the reasons behind this 30-day waiting period, something not mentioned by Jimmy or Trent at all. The Mosaic Law has a consistent pattern of 30 days of grieving for the death of important people. Moses' death required a 30-day grieving period, as did the death of Aaron. That this woman's family may have been killed on the battlefield, it makes perfect sense that the scribes would have regulated a 30-day grieving period for her parents. Also, part of the conversation must be that these ancient Israelites were obsessed with religious purity, and they would have wanted some guarantees that the woman was not pregnant at the time that she was taken off of the battlefield, thus motivating them to have a delay in her having intercourse with the warrior. They simply would have wanted to know that any child born to this woman later on was the warrior's child and not the child of some enemy male. We've already seen verses in Deuteronomy chapter 20 which authorizes Israelite soldiers to take women and children as plunder, and in some cases commands that acts of genocide occur and that women and children are just summarily murdered. But also important to this overall conversation is Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. This unequivocally forbids Israelite warriors to marry enemy women. These verses don't fit in with Jimmy's overall argument of harm mitigation. Ancient Israelite warriors were already authorized to plunder and murder women and children. Verse after verse after verse. Destroy the enemy, destroy their religion, kill their men, enslave their women and children, and loot their valuables. But do not intermarry with them. However, what if some of the enemy's women were hot? Then the scribes needed to make an exception. The war bride verses make perfect sense from a savage's point of view. Israelite warriors would have been motivated to take multiple women off the battlefield as their wives for a variety of obvious reasons. What better way to humiliate a defeated enemy than to take their desirable women home as wives? The warrior also gains repeated sexual access to these multiple wives. He could procreate more of his own children with more wives and use them to take care of his personal household needs. The warrior benefits additionally by not having to pay any bride price. He simply takes the woman off the battlefield for free. The warrior gains a sexualized war trophy. These obvious motivations do not fit in with Jimmy's arguments, which are an attempt to play Catholic people for the fool. Thus, Jimmy doesn't mention them at all. Jimmy piously states that taking the captive's clothing is an effort to make her unattractive. He bolsters this argument by stating that the warrior would replace her clothing with expensive and ugly things to wear. This argument is preposterous. Her clothing was the clothing of the battlefield. Is it filthy? Does it represent the enemy's culture? Jimmy fails to mention that it's the warrior that chooses the clothing that she's going to wear. Is he going to pick something for her that would be appropriate for an Israelite wife to wear, or that something that he feels is appealing for her to wear? It's possible that after the captive is cleaned up and wearing the clothing that the warrior chose, that she could be more attractive to the warrior. Jimmy also suggests that the clothing would be expensive, but he doesn't mention that the warrior was authorized to plunder the wealth of his defeated enemies, thus being able to finance multiple wives. Jimmy speculates that shaving the woman's head is an effort to make her look unattractive and lessen the warrior's lust for her. It is going to make her look unattractive, I will admit that. But is that the actual motivations that the scribes had when they wrote that particular regulation down? The motivations for this regulation are elusive, and I'm forced to speculate. The difference is when I'm speculating or taking guesses, I'm going to admit that I'm speculating. When Jimmy is taking guesses or speculating, he represents it as demonstrable fact. I'm going to speculate as to two potential possibilities not mentioned by Jimmy Akin or Trent Horn as to why the woman would be required to shave her head. The first one would be found in Leviticus chapter 14, which gives the regulations for curing oneself of a skin disease. These regulations are filled with ignorant hocus pocus, one of which is to shave the person with a skin disease head as part of curing them from that. Would an ancient Israelite scribe wanted to know that their captive women were free from any skin diseases prior to having sexual intercourse or being married to an Israelite warrior? It could be a potential reason why they wanted the woman to shave her head to cure any skin diseases that she might have brought into their culture. The second part of the conversation that cannot be ignored is that shaving the woman's head is an attempt to remove her identity and her former culture, a form of ethnic cleansing. She is leaving the culture in which she was captured, and she is becoming an Israelite wife, entering into a completely new culture. That is more likely to be the reasons behind the head shaving than what Jimmy had stated as an effort to make her look ugly.
Even though the Israelites weren't willing to give up this practice at this time, this actually embeds within it the principles that we would apply today, morally speaking, in trying to at least mitigate this and get the guy to stop and reconsider and have a 30-day cooling off period and protect the woman's rights if he then chucks her out.
If the warrior is unsatisfied with the captive's sexual prowess, what is she going to do? Where is she going to go? It's only been 30 days since the captive's head was shaved. She could potentially be pregnant with the warrior's child. She's been raped. Her people are likely to be dead. How is she going to support herself? She might have to resort to begging in the streets. Possibly she could find herself another husband. She could sell herself into slavery, possibly become a prostitute. But would anybody really be surprised if this woman just simply threw herself off of a cliff? Her shaved head could become a problem in continuing to maintain her status as an Israelite. She might very well lose the rights of an Israelite, and if she sold herself into slavery, it could potentially be a lifelong slavery commitment for her, because after all, she was from the enemy's tribe, not born into the Israelite people. Also, this could become problematic with her finding a new husband who may balk at the head-shaved woman who he would know is a rejected enemy person that the warrior himself didn't want. Jimmy's argument paints God as lacking the courage and leadership to control the savagery of his own chosen people. Jimmy, as a Catholic apologist, also fails to recognize the catechism of his own church. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2356, provides the Catholic definition for rape. Rape is the forcible violation of the sexual intimacy of another person. It does injury to justice and charity. Rape deeply wounds the respect, freedom, and physical and moral integrity to which every person has a right. It causes grave damage that can mark the victim for life. It is always an intrinsically evil act. Graver still is the rape of children committed by parents, incest, or those responsible for the education of the children and entrusted to them. This sets up a dilemma, a direct conflict between the Catechism of the Catholic Church and the law that God gave to Moses and that Moses gave to the Israelite people. If rape is always wrong, if it's intrinsically evil, what is it doing in the Mosaic law? Modern laws in reference to kidnapping, false imprisonment, and sexual violence would lead to lengthy prison, if not lifelong prison sentences for suspects committing those crimes. It's just overwhelming evidence that this is not the word of an omniscient, omnibenevolent God. It's simply the poorly written regulations of savage warlords. These regulations are not about harm mitigation or progressive revelation. They are about allowing an Israelite warrior to gain repeated sexual access to captive women that they find desirable through a Mosaic marriage. Further, the point of these regulations is to assimilate those captive women into an Israelite household. And it's true, the captive women do obtain some rights. If their sexual prowess is sufficient to please the warrior, or they have something else to offer, he's very likely to continue to feed and support them. They're definitely being treated better than undesirable women or children who are taken as plunder alongside farm animals or simply murdered on the battlefield. The ideology expressed in these passages makes perfect sense if written by a warlike and barbaric people. That they were inspired by an omniscient, omnibenevolent God makes no sense whatsoever. It's overwhelmingly clear that the creator of the universe had nothing to do with these passages. They're just the writings and ideology of an ancient people. The fact that these passages overtly authorize the rape of captive women is simply because the ignorant barbarians that wrote them have a very different view about sexual violence than we do today. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time. Have a great rest of the day. It's raining here in Southern California, and stay safe.